Wake up and smell the coffee. The UK is in terminal decline. It doesn't matter how fancy a coronation there was or which airline Prince Harry is flying with. Ultimately, it's just a distraction. Today, I want to speak about the decline of the UK stock market specifically and why it matters. Also, whether it can even be fixed. I touched on it previously in my video about ARM choosing to list in New York rather than London, and I want to expand on that today. Every month that goes by, there's another headline about a UK company that is moving its primary listing to the US or in the process of considering it. This isn't to mention all of the successful British companies that have decided to do their IPOs in the US rather than the UK. And why wouldn't they? They command a far higher valuation there than in London. Immunocore is a successful British company that ends up being an example of Britain not getting to enjoy the fruits of its own labours. It was spun out of Oxford University in 1999 and would have received public funding before that. As a small startup, these kind of companies require a large amount of external funding from VCs or otherwise in order to scale up their operations. However, in its early days, Immunocore attracted some backing from domestic investors, but 3 later funding rounds failed to secure any more UK money. So it was no wonder that the company decided to list on the Nasdaq rather than in London. As Sir Bell says, we have a massive upfront commitment to the sciences in the UK, then all the commercial benefits go to investors elsewhere. This state of affairs really doesn't reflect well on Britain, a country which is meant to be a world beater in financial services, and a large portion of the economy is funded by this sector too. So what has caused this magnitude of a decline in the UK stock market? In my opinion, there are a variety of factors that all come together to create a vicious cycle which makes the UK stock market less and less attractive. To start with, there's a missing pillar of domestic retail investors. If we look at America, we can see that 58% of American adults own stock. That's 150 million people. And the value of those stocks add up to over $30 trillion worth. Even though there was a decline in stock ownership following the 2008 recession, it has started to recover back up to 58% in 2022. And crucially, even though the proportion of shares of American companies owned by foreign investors has been increasing over the last few decades, the proportion owned by Americans is still over 60% of the total. Let's contrast these statistics with the UK, where anecdotally I would say that most people have an attitude to investing in stocks and shares where they kind of believe it's akin to gambling. And if they were to invest their money anywhere, it would be in buy-to-let properties, which many have speculated have knock-on problems of its own. So this 2023 survey says that about 18% of Brits own stocks and shares. That's massively lower than the US figures of around 52%. You may feel somewhat reassured by looking at this graph that shows that younger generations are investing more into different asset classes. However, when you look at a graph of what asset classes those generations are investing in, you can see that the older generations are the ones much more likely to invest in stocks, and the younger ones are actually a lot less likely to invest in stocks and more likely to invest in things like cryptocurrency, which is very worrying to me because I personally don't think that crypto has any intrinsic value and will eventually crash, which will mean that a lot of these investors will be put off investing in stocks as well as just crypto for life potentially. Bearing in mind that around 60% of US total equity is owned by American individuals, if we look at this equivalent graph for the UK, it was a similar number in 1963, but it has been slowly, steadily declining over time in the UK, domestic individual ownership of UK stock, to a point where we're only at around 13% now. That's pitiful. At the end of 2020, shares of UK domiciled companies listed on the LSE were worth around £2.17 trillion, or roughly $3 trillion. And if 12 to 13% of that total was owned by UK individual domestic investors, that's around a total of 300 or so billion pounds. Contrast that to $30 trillion worth of American stock owned by domestic investors. The amount of domestic stock owned by British investors is embarrassing in proportion. This means that most UK equity is owned by international investors, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it does drive this vicious cycle of there not being enough domestic funding to improve valuations of UK stocks, which means that good UK companies don't want to invest or list in the UK because they can get a far better valuation if they go and list in the US, for example. As the vicious cycle deepens, then UK investors become less interested in UK equity because all the best companies have listed in the US, and they then go and invest into US companies, which only helps to improve the US and not really the UK. We can see this cycle being played out in real time over the last decade. According to the data, British investors have pulled money out of UK equity funds for the past 6 years, favouring US and global investment strategies. That's in spite of, during 2022, FTSE 100 stocks outperforming due to containing a lot of oil and mining stocks, which are inflation resistant. I actually have some FTSE 100 in my portfolio, and I intend to keep it for a little while longer at least. Even in spite of that, investors are still selling out of UK equity funds. It says there's still a lot of money coming out of UK funds. There's a trend to persistent outflows. The low numbers of UK adults having ever owned stocks or shares is quite a surprising one, because the UK actually has one of the most generous capital gains tax allowances in the world, with currently people only having to pay capital gains on gains above £6,000, and previously that was £12,000. You can also put up to £20,000 per year into a stocks and shares ISA, which means that you don't have to pay capital gains tax on that for the rest of your life, and that's accumulating, so you can put in £20,000 every single year. You would think that more people would take advantage of this. I think the only way that we can encourage more people to invest in stocks and shares rather than keep their money in cash or BTL is to improve the education of kids at school, teach them about investing in stocks and shares and not crypto. The second reason that British stocks are losing relevance is that there's an obsession in the UK with dividends and increasing dividends year on year. This is mostly because older investors are the ones who are invested into British stocks, and they rely on dividends in order to support their lifestyle after retirement. Now, dividends aren't necessarily a bad thing, but when there's an obsession to it with the degree that the UK has, it can really damage companies' growth prospects, as rather than reinvesting into their businesses, they decide to just pay out their cash flows to investors. Here we can see there is an obsession in the UK market with having a progressive dividend policy, which can work for companies with responsible payouts and produce free cash flow and profit growth, but so many companies can't do that. Indeed, many companies that Hutchins looks at consider dividend growth as a priority, even if doing so is detrimental to the business's financial health. Free cash flow could be negative for those businesses, yet they decide to grow their dividend in spite of that, and all that means is they've just got more debt. Is that really the kind of company that you want to be investing in? The FTSE 100 currently has a dividend yield of around 3.8%, whereas the S&P 500 has a dividend yield less than half of that at around 1.6%. And yet, if we look at this graph of the total returns compared between the two indexes, we can see that the FTSE has significantly underperformed over the last 3 years, and this is a pattern that can be seen for the last few decades. Because of the focus on dividends, growth stocks in the FTSE 100 have been ignored, and it's led to the FTSE 100 being labelled the Jurassic Park of index funds, or being a 19th century index, which, to be fair, I think isn't far off the mark. If we look at a sector comparison between the FTSE 100 and the S&P 500, we can see that there's a huge emphasis on information technology in the S&P 500, and that's driven a lot of the gains that we've seen over the last decade. However, in the FTSE 100, there is basically no information technology. There's only one company out of the 100 in the index that is IT focused, and that really isn't a recipe for growth over the coming decades either. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the crabs in the bucket mentality that we have here in the UK. I think it's really detrimental to the country as a whole, and also the UK stock market is held back by it. One example I can think of, which is unrelated to the stock market, but is a good example of this crabs in the bucket mentality, is the VAT tourist tax refund. So before Britain left the EU, any tourist that bought goods above a certain amount of money would get a VAT refund when they left the country. This was designed to encourage tourism to come to the UK and people to spend money, which will help the economy in the long term. However, when the previous government and the current government proposed that we bring back this refund, there was a lot of public opposition to this, with people stating they should have to pay the tax same as we do. And that kind of mentality, where there should only be a benefit if I am receiving it as well, is one that is really holding the country back, especially in matters of corporate pay or even policies like the abolition of share stamp duty tax. Stamp duty is a 0.5% tax that you pay on any purchase of British shares. This means that you effectively start at a 0.5 loss on any purchase of a British company, which is crazy because when you buy an international company, you don't face this at all. So this is holding back UK companies objectively, and there's been a number of recommendations by various different businesses and boards to try and get the government to abolish this. However, it's never been done because it would be extremely politically unpopular with the public, who would see it as, oh, those rich people are getting another tax break. But overall, it would massively help the country. There have been a number of calls for higher executive pay in the UK in order to prevent the top talent leaving for US companies. And whilst not necessarily a panacea to the problems, it's a conversation worth having. But if you look at the British press, you'll just see, oh, those rich people complaining they're not getting enough money. And once again, it doesn't solve anyone's problems. So I think there needs to be a bit more nuance on issues like this. Believe it or not, I do want the UK to succeed and the British stock market to do well in the process. I just think there's so many different issues and a lack of willingness or political willpower in order to fix them. So I don't think the future is that bright for the UK, unfortunately. If you did enjoy this video though, please give me a like and subscribe, and leave a comment if you have any thoughts on the matter.